Ever wonder how frugal cooking tricks helped families survive the hardest days? In the 1930s, these simple meals made the difference between going hungry and getting by. What did we lose when we stopped cooking like this? Rendered bacon grease was one of those things every household in the 1930s held on to like it was gold. When you could not afford fresh butter or oil, the fat left over from breakfast bacon became your miracle ingredient. After the skillet cooled, people would scrape the drippings into jars and stash them away for everything: beans, biscuits, gravy, cornbread, even cooked vegetables. It was smoky, salty, and rich, and it turned even plain cabbage or boiled potatoes into something comforting. If you were lucky enough to have some cracklings left in the mix, all the better. Bacon itself was a luxury, but the grease stretched that flavor over a dozen meals. Nothing went to waste, not even the fat in the pan. Families would pass these jars down week to week like heirlooms, and it was not uncommon for a mother to teach her child exactly when the grease was good and when it had gone off. It kept things edible, and in a lot of homes it kept the whole meal together. It is not just a trick. It was a survival tactic that added flavor when seasoning was a distant dream. A spoonful of bacon grease could mean the difference between bland and bearable. Cabbage water broth might not sound like much, but in the 1930s it was enough to keep people going. Boiling cabbage was already a regular routine, but families quickly learned to never pour the water down the drain. That cloudy, sulfur-scented liquid held nutrients, starch, and just enough flavor to turn into a soup base. Some would throw in a diced potato, a handful of onion skins, or a bit of old bread to thicken it. Others might add salt, if they had any, and call it a night. There was a kind of pride in making something from what others saw as nothing. It might not have tasted like much, but it was hot, filling, and warm on cold days when spirits were thin. In some houses, that broth became the start of a stew that would stretch out over days. You reused everything back then, especially the things no one thought to save. Even the cabbage leaves, once cooked soft and pale, might be mashed and eaten with a splash of vinegar. But the broth was the heart of it. It told a story of making do with what you had, even if it was only boiled water and scraps. It was soup born of hardship and resilience. Breadcrumb stuffing without meat was not just a holiday thing in the 1930s, it was a year-round filler. When families had no sausage, no giblets, and sometimes no roast at all, they would take stale bread, tear it up, and moisten it with water or broth. If you had a little onion or celery, that went in too. The whole mess got baked until crisp on top and soft inside, and it tasted like something far fancier than it was. This was depression cooking at its cleverest. The trick was to use whatever you had to stretch the meal. Sometimes the bread was barely held together with a bit of egg or flour paste. Sometimes it was just bread, salt, and hope. But it filled bellies, and that was what mattered most. People called it stuffing, even if there was nothing to stuff. It would sit in the center of the table like a roast if need be. Some families even sliced it cold the next day and fried it up like savory cake. It was warm, it was simple, and it helped people feel like they still had something special to share. That was the magic of it. Plain food pretending to be more. Lima bean stew was one of those one-pot miracles that got families through the leanest stretches of the 1930s. Dried lima beans were cheap, easy to store, and when soaked and cooked slowly, they turned creamy and rich. Families would simmer them all day with scraps of carrot, onion, or potato, whatever they could find. If they had bacon grease or lard, a spoonful added body. If not, salt and thyme would do the job. There was no recipe, just instinct and adaptation. Sometimes the beans were mashed into a thick paste, sometimes left whole and floating in broth. The stew could stretch over 2 or even 3 days, especially if you kept adding water or leftover vegetables. Kids might complain, but mothers knew. This pot was the difference between full and hungry. In many homes, the smell of beans bubbling away was a kind of comfort. It meant there would be something to eat tonight. It was frugal food with just enough warmth to feel like dinner. In hard times, Lima bean stew taught you patience, resourcefulness, and the power of cooking what you had, not what you wished for. Old-fashioned corn pudding was sweet, soft, and surprisingly hearty, especially for something that came from such humble beginnings. In the 1930s, cornmeal was dirt cheap and endlessly useful, and this dish was one of the cleverest ways to turn it into a filling side: a bit of cornmeal, water or milk, and just enough sugar to make it feel special. Eggs were sometimes added, but often it was just flour, grease, and corn. It came out like a custard or a thick bread pudding, depending on what you had. Baked slowly, it developed a crust on top and a warm, spoonable inside that made it a family favorite. People would eat it hot out of the oven or cold the next morning, sometimes drizzled with molasses or a pat of margarine. It was both side dish and dessert, depending on your mood. There were no store-bought sweets for most folks back then, so corn pudding gave just enough sugar and softness to count as a treat. And for children, it was a rare bite of comfort in a world where food often felt like medicine. It was poor man's pudding, but it tasted like something richer. Ketchup sandwiches were not a joke back then. They were survival. 2 slices of white bread, a squeeze of ketchup, and that was lunch. When fresh tomatoes were too expensive or gone altogether, the bottle stood in. It was cheap, it was sweet, and it gave just enough tang to fool your brain into thinking you had a real sandwich. Sometimes people would add onions or pickles if they had them, but most of the time it was just the red stuff and bread. And you would be surprised how many kids looked forward to it. It was bright, flavorful, and in a decade where most meals were beige, that mattered more than you would think. Ketchup was a staple condiment because it had a long shelf life and could cover the taste of anything going off. In this case, it became the main event. Parents handed it out with a smile, even if their hearts sank doing it. It was food, and that counted. You might laugh at it today, but in the 1930s, ketchup sandwiches were a reminder that even when the pantry was bare, you could still pretend to eat like everyone else. Fried cornmeal mush cakes were born from the same pot twice. You would make cornmeal mush, just cornmeal, water, maybe a pinch of salt, let it set in a pan overnight, and slice it into firm pieces the next day. Then you fried those slices in grease until the edges crisped up like polenta. It was crunchy on the outside, soft on the inside, and just enough to fool you into thinking you were eating something indulgent. Back in the 1930s, this was how you stretched a single meal into 2. The mush might have been dinner one night and breakfast the next morning. Some people served it with syrup or molasses, while others went savory and added onions or lard. There was no right or wrong. It was all about using what was left. You did not throw anything out, especially not a whole pot of cooled mush. It became a habit, a ritual, even a comfort. Children would dunk the crispy slices in milk or eat them straight from the pan. It was Depression-era cooking at its most honest. Plain ingredients, repurposed with care, turned into something worth looking forward to. Wilted lettuce salad was not just about saving soggy greens. It was about making the most of what the garden gave, even past its prime. When lettuce started to wilt in the heat or after a few days indoors, families did not toss it. Instead, they poured hot bacon grease mixed with vinegar over the top, reviving the leaves into something tender and flavorful. The heat wilted the lettuce just enough, and the vinegar gave it a punch of brightness. Bits of onion or crumbled bacon were added when possible, but the core of the dish was that sizzling pour. It turned tired lettuce into a warm salad with more depth than any cold dressing could offer. You did not need much to make it feel special. It was a moment when something old felt new again. In a time of extreme frugality, it captured the mindset perfectly. Do not throw it out. Just use it differently. Wilted lettuce was not a fallback. It was a quiet trick that helped people feel like they still had a choice at the table. Jelly omelets were the kind of oddball depression dish that worked better than expected. Eggs were easier to get than meat, especially if you had chickens, but they still had to stretch. So when there was no bacon or sausage, people got creative. They spread jam or jelly inside a folded omelet and served it like breakfast dessert. Grape, apple, strawberry, whatever you had, often homemade and preserved. It was sweet, soft, and oddly satisfying. The egg and sugar made something that felt like a treat, even if it was born of necessity. For children, it was special. For adults, it was just another way to avoid waste. You could swap in stewed fruit or mashed banana if jelly was gone. It was quick, flexible, and checked every box for a depression meal. It might seem strange today, but it made sense back then. When food was limited, taste mattered more than rules. Rice-stuffed baked apples were one of those meals that towed the line between dinner and dessert. Apples stored well through winter, and rice was cheap, filling, and easy to cook. Together, they made something practical and gently sweet. You hollowed an apple, stuffed it with cooked rice, and baked it until it softened and started to collapse. If you had cinnamon or brown sugar, great. If not, a pat of lard did the trick. Some added milk to make it creamier. It was not fancy or meant to impress, but it filled stomachs and made children smile. In a time where smiles were hard to come by, that counted. These apples were often served after a bowl of soup or beans as a way to end on something soft. They warmed the kitchen and reminded folks that even hard times had gentle endings. Boiled bread dumplings were a Depression lifesaver when meat was gone and vegetables were thin. Families took stale bread, ends or crusts, and soaked them in water or milk until soft. Then they added flour, maybe an egg, and salt or onion. This got rolled into dumplings and boiled until firm. They soaked up broth and stretched soups into meals that could feed 5 instead of 2. The texture was dense, like a sponge that clung to every drop of flavor. Sometimes they were served with just gravy or fat drippings. They were not pretty, but they filled you up and gave the illusion of plenty. And in a time when illusions were all you had, that meant something. Bread dumplings turned trash into dinner, and that was enough. Celery and onion soup was bare bones, but it comforted. In homes where meat was missing and vegetables were gone by midweek, all you had were scraps. Celery tops, onion peels, maybe a clove of garlic. These simmered in water for hours, making broth that tasted better than expected. If you had grease or drippings, they went in. Bread crusts were added for body, and sometimes a bit of flour thickened it. The smell was half the meal, a warm scent that made you think something grand was cooking. But the truth was simpler. You were eating what others threw out. Still, in the 1930s, this was cooking smart. It gave warmth, flavor, and one more night of feeling okay. Hardtac with gravy was a way of reviving something almost too tough to chew into something soft and sustaining. Hardtac, that old sailor's biscuit made of just flour and water, was shelf-stable and cheap. You could find it in army rations and emergency pantries, and in the Great Depression, people brought it back out of necessity. By itself, it was like biting into a brick. But soak it in milk or water, then smother it in gravy or fat, and suddenly you had something warm and edible. The gravy could be made from bacon drippings, flour, and whatever seasonings you had on hand. Sometimes people would stir in bits of onion or mashed beans to bulk it out. The result was soft, salty, and just enough like dinner to satisfy. Kids might not have loved it, but they learned to eat it fast. It filled you up and made good use of food that was meant to last forever. In hard times, that mattered. Hardtac with gravy was a lesson in patience, in chewing, and in making do with what you had, even if what you had was practically stone. Molasses milk was poor man's cocoa, and for many families it was the closest thing to a sweet treat they could manage. All it took was a splash of hot milk, sometimes powdered, sometimes fresh, and a spoonful of molasses stirred in. The result was dark, rich, and full of iron, with a strong flavor that kids either loved or learned to tolerate. It had warmth, it had sweetness, and it came with none of the cost of chocolate, which had all but vanished from most households during the 1930s. Molasses was one of the most common sweeteners at the time because it was cheaper than sugar and had a longer shelf life. It also felt hearty, like something that was doing your body good, even if the cupboard was nearly empty. Some families drank this before bed. Others served it in place of breakfast. It was a quiet comfort, often ladled out in chipped mugs, handed off with a tired smile and a reminder to sip slowly. Molasses milk might not sound glamorous today, but back then, it tasted like safety. And that was worth more than anything else. Pickled beet eggs looked almost too strange to eat, But they were one of the smartest ways to stretch a protein that was hard to come by. Eggs were precious, and when you had a few on hand, preserving them meant you could enjoy them over days instead of one single meal. The trick was in the brine. You took leftover beet juice, usually from canned or boiled beets, added vinegar and some spices, and dropped peeled boiled eggs into the jar. After a few days, they turned bright pink and took on a tangy, earthy flavor that was far more interesting than a plain boiled egg. The color made them feel like a treat, especially to children who had not seen anything festive in months. These were served at room temperature, sometimes sliced onto bread or mashed into sandwiches. They could last for over a week in a cool place, which made them ideal for families without ice boxes. They were flavorful, pretty to look at, and most importantly, long-lasting. Pickled beet eggs were one of those strange depression dishes that did not just make do, but made something new. Grated raw potato pancakes were born out of pure necessity and just a little bit of grease. All you needed was a couple of raw potatoes, some flour to bind, an onion if you had it, and a hot skillet. Shred it all fine, press out the water, mix it together, and fry until golden. What came out was crispy at the edges, soft in the middle, and filling enough to count as breakfast, lunch, or dinner. These pancakes did not pretend to be fancy, they just showed up and got the job done. Potatoes were the backbone of many meals in the 1930s because they were cheap, lasted forever in storage, and grew in poor soil. You could trade for them, grow them, and feed a family for days with just a sack. These cakes were sometimes topped with applesauce or served alongside beans or eaten plain and hot off the pan. They were adaptable, frugal, and satisfying. A hot cake in a cold kitchen was enough to lift your spirits a bit. That crunch meant you were doing okay, at least for today. Appleskin tea was what you made when even the scraps had scraps. In homes where nothing went to waste, apple peels left over from canning or pie making were gathered and boiled into a weak but fragrant tea. It smelled sweet like cider, even if the taste was faint. Sometimes people added cinnamon sticks or cloves, but most of the time it was just water and skins. Served hot, it warmed your hands and gave you the sense that you were drinking something more than water. In a time when every ingredient had to pull double duty, this was how you honored what little you had. Appleskin tea was often sipped at night after supper when the fire had burned low and the day's work was done. It was not about nourishment so much as comfort. A hot mug of anything in the Great Depression was an act of care. You felt it going down, slow and steady, and it reminded you that sweetness could still be coaxed from the barest leftovers. Scrap-fried hash was the kind of meal that told you exactly how your week had gone, by what ended up in the pan. Families would take the odds and ends from dinner all week long, bits of meat, soft vegetables, maybe a few spoonfuls of rice or beans, and toss them into a skillet with grease and onion. Fried together, pressed down, and turned crisp, it became something new. Not quite a stew, not quite a cake, just a hash. You never made it the same way twice, but somehow it always came out tasting like something more than the sum of its parts. Some households planned for it, saving their scraps carefully in a tin. Others pulled it together on nights when there was not enough of any one thing. It was salty, savory, and always hot. You could stretch it with potatoes, bulk it out with gravy, or stuff it in bread and call it a sandwich. What mattered was that it filled plates and kept everyone quiet for a while. Scrap-fried hash was not just thrifty, it was practical hope on a plate. Homemade noodles made from just flour and water were a Depression staple that turned bare cupboards into something hearty. No eggs, no fancy tools, just a rolling pin, a knife, and some determination. Families would mix flour with water until it formed a stiff dough, then roll it thin and cut it into strips or shapes. The noodles were left to dry or boiled right away and dropped into soups, stews, or even just salted water. They soaked up flavor like a sponge, which was perfect when you had more broth than solids. Making noodles became a family affair, with children helping to roll and cut on floured tables. Sometimes people hung them over chairs or laid them out on dish towels to dry. It was messy work, but it filled time and bellies alike. When store-bought pasta was out of the question, these homemade versions stepped in proudly. They had chew, they had bite, and they gave even the thinnest broth some heft. It was food you made from almost nothing, and that always meant something. Crumbled biscuit breakfast bowls were a warm and simple way to start a cold morning when you had almost nothing left. The trick was to take yesterday's biscuits, already hard or going stale, break them into pieces and pour over hot milk. Add a pinch of sugar, maybe a bit of cinnamon or molasses, and let the mixture soak until the biscuit softened. What you got was something between a porridge and a bread pudding. It was not fancy, but it was filling, warm, and easy on the stomach. In the 1930s, breakfast was often made from leftovers, and this one was a favorite among both children and adults. The milk made it feel rich. The sugar gave it a sweet lift. And the biscuit? That was just doing its job one more time before being truly done. It was a gentle way to begin the day, especially when the day ahead promised to be anything but gentle. This bowl of sweet, soggy comfort was more than a meal. It was a quiet promise that even the smallest things could be made useful again. Tomato aspic salad was a Depression-era invention that tried its best to look fancy when there was nothing in the pantry but pantry itself. It was made by dissolving gelatin in hot tomato juice, then mixing in chopped onions, celery, vinegar, and sometimes even shredded carrots if you had them. Once it was poured into a mold or a shallow dish and chilled, it firmed up into something like a savory jelly. It sounds odd to us now, but back in the 1930s, it was considered a creative way to stretch tomatoes and vegetables into a salad-like side dish. It was cold, tangy, and often served at community meals or church suppers when no one could afford fresh produce. Housewives took pride in slicing it clean and presenting it on a bed of wilted lettuce or cabbage leaves. It looked elegant in its strange little way, like a meal trying to be better than it was. Some topped it with a spoonful of mayonnaise or cottage cheese to add richness, though most just served it plain. Tomato aspic may not have been anyone's favorite dish, but it was admired for how little it took to make something that felt proper. Zebac toast was the kind of food that got made, stored, and reused until there was nothing left but crumbs. Originally a German recipe, zebac is twice-baked bread, meaning it is baked once, sliced, and then dried out in the oven until crisp. During the 1930s, it became a go-to staple for households trying to stretch bread that was starting to go stale. The result was crunchy, dry, and perfect for storing without refrigeration. It could be softened with warm milk and sugar for children or crumbled into puddings and meatloaf fillers to bulk out recipes. Some families even soaked it in broth or fruit juice for dessert-like treats. When biscuits were gone and crackers were out of reach, zebac toast filled the gap. It had a mild flavor and could go sweet or savory, depending on what you added. People loved it for its reliability. It would not mold, spoil, or turn on you. You could keep it in a tin for weeks and still count on it to do its job. For babies and the elderly, it was soaked soft. For everyone else, it was just one more way to stretch bread far past its shelf life. Gravy over rice might sound like a side dish today, but in the 1930s, it was often the main event. When meat was scarce and vegetables were few, the leftover drippings from a roast, or even just some bacon grease and flour, got turned into gravy. Pour that over a pot of plain boiled rice, and suddenly you had dinner. It was salty, it was filling, and it used things that might otherwise go to waste. Gravy made even the blandest starch taste rich, and rice was a cheap staple that went a long way. Families would keep jars of fat and reuse every spoonful, sometimes adding a splash of milk or a bit of onion for extra depth. It was not about variety, it was about sustenance. One bowl of this could keep you full through a whole day's work, and that was all anyone hoped for. Some children grew up thinking this was a real meal, not realizing it was born of necessity. It was practical, thrifty, and as comforting as it was humbling. You did not need a feast. You just needed something hot, salty, and spoonable. Plain boiled wheat berries were a dish that reminded people just how far they had come, and how far they still had to go. Wheat berries are whole, unprocessed kernels of wheat that take a long time to cook and an even longer time to chew. But during the Depression, they were affordable, full of fiber, and could be bought in bulk. Families would boil them for hours, softening them just enough to be spooned into bowls like porridge. Sometimes a bit of salt or molasses was added, but most of the time it was just grain and water. The texture was dense, almost nutty, and the feeling of fullness lasted longer than most other meals. It was common on farms and in rural communities where wheat was grown or traded directly. The simplicity of it made it reliable, and when paired with a piece of bread or a spoonful of jam, it could pass as breakfast or dinner. Some families toasted leftover wheat berries to reuse in stews or baked them into loaves. No part of the grain was wasted, and no meal was taken for granted. This was not food for pleasure. It was food for survival. Beet green stir-fry was a shining example of how the 1930s turned scraps into sustenance. When you bought or harvested beets, the leafy tops were never discarded. They were cooked. In fact, they were often more valuable than the beet itself. Families would wash them carefully, chop them up, and sauté them in bacon grease, lard, or whatever fat they had. Add a sprinkle of salt or a bit of vinegar, and you had a side dish that tasted far better than its humble roots. The greens were full of nutrients and gave meals color and texture. In cities and rural homes alike, people grew beets in small plots, and nothing was allowed to go to waste. These greens cooked quickly, wilted down, and took on the flavor of whatever you cooked them in. Served alongside potatoes, beans, or cornbread, they added just enough brightness to break up the monotony. It was not fancy, it was smart. Beet greens helped families stretch their gardens, their groceries, and their budgets. You might not miss them now, but back then, they made the difference between a plate that looked full and one that looked empty. Sweet potato pie without eggs was a testament to how much flavor could be pulled from so little. Eggs were expensive, milk was scarce, and sugar had to be stretched, but sweet potatoes were dependable. You could bake them, mash them, and mix them with a bit of flour, spices, and molasses to create a smooth filling that held together without help. The crust was optional, and in many homes it was skipped entirely to save flour and fat. The pie was poured into a greased tin and baked until it firmed at the edges and browned just slightly on top. It was soft, earthy, and just sweet enough to count as dessert. Sometimes people would add a dab of butter or a splash of vinegar to deepen the flavor. You did not need whipped cream or toppings. This was comfort on its own. It tasted like autumn, like Sunday dinner, like something you made from scratch and with care. Sweet potato pie was not about presentation. It was about getting a little joy out of the root vegetables you had on hand. And back then, that joy meant everything. Corncob broth proved that even what looked like trash still had a job to do. After eating the corn kernels, usually boiled or cut from the cob, people would save the cobs and toss them into a pot of water. Add a few onion peels or garlic skins, and you had the beginnings of a mild, slightly sweet broth. It was not strong, but it had body. You could use it as a soup base, to cook rice or beans, or even sip it hot with a pinch of salt. Some families swore it helped stretch out meals when nothing else was left. In many kitchens, this broth was a weekly ritual in summer when corn was in season. The cobs would sit in the pot all day, simmering slowly until they gave up their last bits of flavor. It was depression logic at its finest. Do not waste what you cannot replace. Even stripped bare, the cobs still had something left to give. This broth turned scraps into sustenance, and sustenance into a survival tool. Sour milk biscuits were what happened when nothing could go to waste, not even spoiled milk. In the 1930s, refrigeration was rare and expensive, so milk often turned sour before it could all be used. But instead of tossing it, home cooks put it to work. The acid in the sour milk reacted with baking soda, creating lift and softness in biscuit dough. No need for eggs, no need for fresh buttermilk. You just mixed flour, fat, soda, and that slightly sour milk into a sticky dough and dropped it onto a hot baking sheet. The result was a light, tender biscuit with a subtle tang. Some families added herbs or sugar, depending on what they had. Others used bacon grease instead of butter or skipped salt altogether. These biscuits were eaten with molasses, honey, gravy, or just plain. They were fast, filling, and above all, forgiving. If the milk was on the edge of turning but not gone completely, it was a perfect fit. Sour milk biscuits were one of those practical tricks passed from mother to daughter, a quiet way of making sure nothing got thrown out before it gave all it had. Crustless onion pie was a depression dish that found a way to taste rich without spending a dime on extras. The crust was left out to save on flour and fat, and instead, the filling became the star. Chopped onions were sautéed in grease, layered into a pan, and covered with a mixture of eggs, flour, and water or milk, whatever was available. Sometimes a bit of cheese or herbs made it in, but most of the time it was just plain, seasoned with salt and pepper. It baked into something soft, savory, and incredibly satisfying. The onions caramelized slightly, giving the dish a natural sweetness that balanced the richness of the eggs. It was served sliced like a pie, though it felt more like a casserole or a crustless quiche. Perfect for dinner or even breakfast, and always appreciated for how cheap and clever it was. It could feed many with little and gave a sense of fullness that lasted. Crustless onion pie was proof that frugal did not have to mean flavorless. Baked rice and onion casserole was simple, plain, and deeply dependable. In the hardest years of the 1930s, families needed meals that filled the belly without emptying the pantry, and this one checked every box. You started with raw rice, mixed it with chopped onions and whatever fat you had, bacon grease, lard, even a dab of margarine. Sometimes a splash of milk or broth went in for moisture, but often it was just water and a bit of salt. The whole thing was baked slowly in the oven until the rice swelled, the onions softened, and the top formed a thin, crisp crust. It smelled like comfort and tasted like survival. There was nothing fancy in it, but that was the point. It worked. You could serve it hot for dinner or eat the leftovers cold for breakfast. Some added beans, others stirred in eggs to bulk it up. But even in its bare form, it felt like a full meal. It was the kind of dish that disappeared fast because it was familiar, filling, and just warm enough to carry you through. This one's a bit of a stretch, and being honest, I'm not sure how I feel about using this either. People used to make their own ice cream back in the day, also because modern refrigeration as we're used to hadn't become a thing yet. Even when it did, it took a while for it to be so mass-produced that every house in the country had a fridge. People were trying things like the pot freezer method, which involved placing a large bowl of ice cream batter in a tub of ice and salt. Most methods that you need to make your own ice cream at home are a bit too labor-intensive, really. For early settlers and rural communities, nothing went to waste, especially when it came to hogs. Hog's head cheese was born out of necessity and practicality, utilizing parts of the pig that might otherwise be discarded. While it's technically a terrine, it's not cheese at all, but a savory, jellied loaf made from boiled pig's head, ears, and sometimes trotters. The ingredients were humble: pork, vinegar, spices, and whatever else could be found on hand. These cuts of meat, rich in collagen, gave the dish its unique texture and flavor. Back then, preservation was everything. Whether it was smoked, salted, or chilled, hog's head cheese had staying power. It could last for weeks without refrigeration, an essential quality in the pre-canning days. Culturally, it was a dish that spoke to resourcefulness. It was food for those who had to make every scrap count, and it carried significance across various regions, especially in the South. Whether served cold on crackers or eaten as a filling for sandwiches, it provided nourishment that could stretch a meal. But beyond its practicality, it was also a symbol of ingenuity. It wasn't fancy or glamorous, but it was a lifeline. One of the other things that was pushed to the mainstream thanks to the Dust Bowl was the reliance on one-pot meals. Stuff like vegetable pot pie with a biscuit crust really made the rounds just about everywhere. It was because it was so easy to pool together different kinds of vegetables to make one massive serving of pot pie, oftentimes more than just for a family. People would basically realize this. If they shared the amount of vegetables and resources they had, they could honestly make a lot more. Community-based ingredient sharing and food preparation once again became a thing. Entire neighborhoods were once again eating together, and it was a big part of how people managed to survive. This pot pie was a one-stop solution to massive amounts of hunger. and often people would throw in whatever kind of vegetables they had in there. This would typically look like your average mix of cabbage, onions, garlic, tomatoes, potatoes, and the rest, but people would try to add in aromatics to get some flavor going too. It was little stuff like this that really helped keep things together for everyone because, on their own, people didn't have the energy to cook big meals like this very often. You heard me talking about patching clothes, and I was for real. You can really just sew up anything. The odd button that's missing, the patch of worn fabric, the holes in the middle you don't want anyone seeing, all fixable problems and fixable for free if you knew what you were doing. Plus, I think it adds a rustic and vintage vibe to some clothes. I know patchwork looks really good on sweaters. What do you think? Can we find some cute and chic ways to reincorporate patching up old clothes back into our lives? In the rural South, nothing says comfort food quite like cornbread, except when it's loaded with cracklins. These crispy bits of fried pork skin not only add flavor but also represent a deep connection to resourcefulness during tough times. Cracklin cornbread was born out of necessity, created by farmers and settlers who used every part of the hog to ensure nothing went to waste. The cracklins, the byproduct of rendering pork fat, were mixed into cornbread for added texture, fat, and flavor. Simple ingredients like cornmeal, buttermilk, and the coveted cracklins were staples in southern pantries. But what really made this dish special was how it could stretch a meal, providing nourishment and filling bellies during long days of labor. With no refrigeration, pork fat was often used for preservation, and cornbread could be baked in large batches to last for days, making it both practical and economical. Culturally, cracklin cornbread holds a place in Southern culinary tradition, often served alongside beans, greens, or a hearty stew. It symbolizes a time when every part of the animal was used and no meal was complete without a little indulgence in crispy pork fat. Potato and chickpea curry with rice was a really good combination that was pretty much built for the environment people were finding themselves in the Dust Bowl. The recipe changed with each different area and state, but for the most part, the core mix of potatoes, dried peas, and rice was the same. People would substitute white rice with brown rice wherever they could because the latter was cheaper, and it made sense to stretch your pantries out as much as you possibly could. Potatoes, especially, were a rock-solid friend to rely on for the American people. They were one of the easiest things you could possibly grow. You could make so many things perfect for a large number of people with them, and they were full of health benefits. A side bonus was that they'd really keep you full, but all this should give you an idea. It was almost impossible to exist without having a good stock of potatoes in your root basement. Onions, garlic, a water-based broth, and just thyme and salt pepper were used for the curry. Pretty bare bones, right? Yet to them, that was still a phenomenal dish to come home to. Another nifty little trick people could really benefit from is using ebooks or old textbooks bought secondhand instead of fresh new ones. Let's be honest, these are starting to cost a lot, and the pursuit of knowledge is never something you should be financially exempt from. Not that people aren't, but at least you should be able to read your books without worrying about how it's going to affect your finances for the month, right? If that sounds like you, and if reading is a passionate hobby, or if you're just a student who's struggling to save some cash, then buying used textbooks might be a good idea. In the kitchens of the American South, where resourcefulness reigned supreme, nothing went to waste, especially not pot liquor, the nutrient-rich broth left behind after cooking greens like collards or turnip greens. This flavorful liquid, often overlooked today, became the star of a humble but ingenious creation: pot liquor biscuits. For families with limited resources, every drop of nutrition counted. Pot liquor, infused with vitamins, minerals, and the smoky essence of cured pork, was far too valuable to discard. So instead of plain water or milk, it became the liquid base for biscuit dough, enriching a simple staple with added flavor and sustenance. The result was biscuits with a story baked into every crumb, a testament to ingenuity and survival. While the ingredients were basic, flour, pot liquor, fat, and perhaps a pinch of salt, the biscuits carried the weight of history. Greens were a cornerstone of Southern diets, cultivated in small gardens or foraged from the wild, and pot liquor was their flavorful legacy. Pairing it with biscuits turned this broth into a meal, stretching resources without sacrificing taste. It's said that Southern cooks considered pot liquor liquid gold, and they weren't wrong. In an era when food waste wasn't an option, these biscuits embodied the art of making something extraordinary out of the ordinary. Ritz cracker meat pies were basically just your average meat pie affair, but with Ritz crackers thrown on top. Not really too inspiring, I know, but hey, it worked. Why do you think people resorted to something this simple? A lot of the time, it was less about the flavor, the texture, and what it was adding to the dish, and it was more about the fact that something new was being thrown in at all. The thing about sticking to a budget is that you really can't step out of it. You can't get a sweet little treat for yourself. You can't spend extra on white sugar instead of brown sugar. You can't afford that extra bit of flour, or that fancy cheese, or the wine. Never the wine. Regardless, sticking to a budget means suppressing your heart every day, because at the end of each and every 24 hours, you just need the money more. You might be happy in the moment when you cave into the impulse and get the thing you have your eyes set on, but when you're in bed worrying about your finances, you'll regret it. Ritz crackers, on the other hand, were literally just for a few cents. What harm could that cause? What could it do? Not only did it work as a breakfast option with toast or tea, but it also worked amazingly as a substitute for breadcrumbs. On meat pies, it was something that helped give them a crispier crust and edge, which honestly made a world of difference to people who were deeply bored of meat pies by the 90s. When early settlers and Native Americans needed a reliable drink for sustenance, they turned to the rich, fatty nuts that grew on the hickory tree. Hickory nut milk was a clever solution, blending the nuts with water to create a creamy, high-calorie beverage. Not only did it taste great, but it offered a much-needed source of energy in a world where food wasn't always easy to come by. Harvesting hickory nuts was no small task. They had to be cracked open to get to the nut inside, which was a labor-intensive process. Once collected, the nuts were often ground into a paste or crushed and steeped in water to make the milk. To preserve it, settlers either drank it fresh or stored it in jars, hoping it would keep until they could use it. This nutrient-dense milk packed a punch. With plenty of healthy fats and a good dose of protein, it was ideal for long days of physical labor. It could also serve as a substitute for milk in cooking, adding a rich, nutty flavor to various dishes. While it wasn't always the easiest to make, hickory nut milk was an invaluable resource, representing the resourcefulness of those who used it. Fried dough delights were a pretty good treat during the Depression. See, normal pastry dough and crusts were getting very out of reach for most people, so alternatives often looked like these deep-fried pastries that we're about to go into. Some of them used to be sold by street vendors, but most were often made at home. The treats became something Americans passionately indulged in, and that's how they found their place in the culture as well. The cultural roots of fried dough are pretty much rooted in their daily use, at least if you speak about the culture in relevance to the Depression. Their roots do go deeper than that, though, since it's been a thing in America since at least the 17th and 18th centuries. In the 1920s, fairs and festivals that would happen would often have fried pastry or dough delights for sale, and most street vendors would often sell them too. While the fairs and festivals definitely stopped, street vendors never failed to see the business opportunity in fried dough delights. Push carts, especially in urban areas where people still had a bit of money to spare, became one of the most common sights to see in a city. That was how people satisfied their sweet tooth. And I'll admit, it's one part of daily American life that didn't get hit lethally hard by the Depression. Fried dough delights were a pretty good treat during the Depression. See, normal pastry dough and crusts were getting very out of reach for most people, so alternatives often looked like these deep-fried pastries that we're about to go into. Some of them used to be sold by street vendors, but most were often made at home. The treats became something Americans passionately indulged in, and that's how they found their place in the culture as well. The cultural roots of fried dough are pretty much rooted in their daily use, at least if you speak about the culture in relevance to the Depression. Their roots do go deeper than that, though, since it's been a thing in America since at least the 17th and 18th centuries. In the 1920s, fairs and festivals that would happen would often have fried pastry or dough delights for sale, and most street vendors would often sell them too. While the fairs and festivals definitely stopped, street vendors never failed to see the business opportunity in fried dough delights. Push carts, especially in urban areas where people still had a bit of money to spare, became one of the most common sights to see in a city. That was how people satisfied their sweet tooth. And I'll admit, it's one part of daily American life that didn't get hit lethally hard by the Depression. For centuries, corn has been a cornerstone of American cuisine, and one of its earliest forms of preservation was parching. Pioneers and Native Americans alike would dry and roast corn kernels to make them last longer during harsh winters or long trips. This method, simple yet effective, allowed people to carry lightweight, nutrient-dense food that could be eaten on the go. To make parched corn, you only need two ingredients: corn and heat. The kernels would be roasted until they were golden and crunchy, a process that preserved the corn's nutrients and energy while making it easy to transport. The result was a snack that could be carried in a pouch or woven into a bag, perfect for travelers, soldiers, and settlers in need of sustenance. In terms of nutrition, parched corn was a powerhouse. Packed with carbohydrates, fiber, and essential fats, it provided the energy needed to power through physically demanding tasks like farming or trekking across unknown territory. But parching wasn't without its challenges. The corn had to be carefully roasted to avoid burning, and the preservation process relied on the availability of fresh, healthy corn. In the days before refrigerators, it was all about making what you had last. Remember when I talked about how much communal spirit people had during the 1930s? I wasn't lying. The Great Depression brought the good neighbor out of everybody, and lots of people decided to double down on being the best one they could be. People would cook meals for their entire neighborhood with their neighbors and pool in resources together to make sure that they had enough for the whole block. This was actually so good because it meant if you were running low on supplies, you could negotiate with your neighbors. Work something out. They could substitute something for you. You could help them out with something. Pooling in ingredients like that meant that everyone's families were eating a lot more than they could usually afford to as well, and I think it's something we could bring back. Do you get along with your neighbors well enough to try something like this? And if you have, share your experiences down below. Pickled vegetables, the crunchy, tangy, fizzy wonders that kept people from starving when fresh food wasn't an option. Cabbage, cucumbers, carrots, basically anything that could fit in a jar and swim in vinegar. Pickling is one of humanity's oldest methods of food preservation, dating back over 4,000 years to ancient Mesopotamia. People knew a simple truth: when life hands you cucumbers, make pickles. The magic of pickling lies in the preservation process. By immersing veggies in brine or vinegar, you create an acidic environment that prevents spoilage. This means you can have fresh, nutrient-rich food in the dead of winter when fresh produce is nowhere to be found. Cabbage, for example, transforms into sauerkraut, a fermented powerhouse full of vitamin C and probiotics, exactly what you need to survive a long winter and fight off scurvy. Pickled cucumbers were a favorite of ancient Egyptians and even made their way into the diet of Julius Caesar's army, who believed they boosted their strength. If pickles are good enough for Roman soldiers, they're definitely good enough for your sandwich. It also added flavor, a burst of acidity and crunch to otherwise bland meals. They kept things fresh, fought off food waste, and gave humans something to bite into when the pantry was bare. So the next thing on our list is baked turnips and cream sauces. But dear viewer, I know you aren't 5, and I know you're curious about how cream sauces could even be a thing in a time like this. After all, if people were struggling to get enough milk and eggs, where on God's green earth were they finding the money to get cream for? You see, my friend, there was a stark difference in lifestyles between two types of people: those that grew up in the city and those that grew up in the countryside. Now, for the people trapped in those urban jungles during the Dust Bowl, I completely agree with you. Where did they get their cream from? For the ones living in rural shanty towns, though, well, you gotta know that they came from a long tradition of farming, a tradition that by the 1930s was still relatively upheld by most families. This meant that lots of these farming households had their own cattle and cows, and that's how they would get their milk and cream. Baked turnips, on the other hand, were something that was more commonly seen in the cities. It was, after all, something that primarily required an oven. In rural areas, it was a lot more common for people to pass the time with boiled turnips instead, but sometimes people would get. So you had people who, on one hand, were eating cabbages and making cabbage soup, either out of frugality or a lack of, well, just about anything else, and on the other, people were eating things like shepherd's pie regularly. I mean, it wasn't just money, though, that was making people eat like this. The cabbage soup diet, for example, was a fine showcase of how the health craze had taken over a lot of people's minds. That was basically a big fat loss diet that got really trendy throughout the 80s. How does this circle back to shepherd's pie? You see, it's people who would basically stick to meals like this pie religiously every other day that inspired things like the health craze. Hey, shepherd's pie wasn't really what you would call pricey or expensive, but it wasn't exactly as cheap as the rest of the things on the list so far, too. This artifact of British culture served American homes well in the 80s. Honestly, it was more popular with families that had a lot of kids and in-laws or extended family living with them. However, the thing here is, it's just not good for you to eat pie too regularly. Maybe if that's all you eat, but if you pair that up with all the other junk people began consuming in the 80s and 90s, you start to see why this can be a pretty serious issue that inspires people to have a bit more cabbage soup. Something people always were fond of doing back then was fixing and maintaining their own shoes. They didn't even have the cultural emphasis on sneakers we do today. Nowadays, your shoes count for a lot more of your outfit than they did for people of the past. I mean, hey, having nice and ready shoes was still important then, but now it's like you might get dissed for it. Which is why I think knowing how to fix and maintain your own shoes, reselling them, replacing those laces, and knowing your way with some shoe polish, all of that's really important. In the 18th and 19th centuries, when winter meant months of limited food options, preserving vegetables was a matter of survival. String beans, a staple crop, were transformed into leather breeches by a method that's as resourceful as it is simple. The beans were strung up on twine and left to dry in the sun, turning them into long, leathery strips that could be rehydrated and cooked when needed. With no refrigeration and long winters ahead, communities had to ensure they had a stockpile of nutritious food. The dried beans, once rehydrated, could be stewed with pork fat or whatever meat was available, creating a flavorful and hearty dish. While not glamorous, leather breeches were an efficient and effective solution. Culturally, they symbolize the ingenuity and resilience of the pioneer spirit. Farmers, often with limited resources, knew how to make every crop stretch. Leather breeches weren't just a food, they were a survival tool. Beans, readily available in the summer, could be stored for months, ensuring families had something to eat when fresh produce was scarce. The true value of leather breeches wasn't just in the beans, but in the resourcefulness they represented, a testament to making the most out of what you had. Preserved foods are time-tested essentials, expertly crafted to outlast the seasons and keep hunger at bay, no matter the circumstances. Salted meat, the original meat preservation hack before freezers were even a dream. Whether it was jerky, salted fish, or cured pork, this method was a game-changer for survival, because salt is basically nature's food kryptonite. It stops bacteria in their tracks, keeping meat edible for weeks, months, or even years. For our ancestors, this meant protein on demand. No spoilage, no waste, just salty goodness. Salt was so valuable in ancient times it was literally used as currency. Roman soldiers were sometimes paid in salarium, or salt money. Yep, that's where the word salary comes from. And they weren't just munching on jerky for kicks. Salted meat kept armies marching, sailors sailing, and explorers exploring. It was essential for long journeys when fresh food was impossible to keep. Without it, forget discovering new continents. Most ships wouldn't have made it past week 2. Jerky, dried to chewy perfection, came from indigenous peoples of the Americas, who used the sun, smoke, and salt to preserve meat. Meanwhile, salted cod became the fish that fed the world, fueling trade routes and diets from Europe to the Caribbean. Long-lasting, portable, and packed with protein, it kept people alive and moving. Cornbread was also used as a substitute for the typical ingredients you would use for a pancake. And speaking of vegetables, One of the most reliable ones in the Depression for the country as a whole were potatoes. You can kind of see where I'm going with this, can't you? You've probably been around the block with potato pancakes more than a few times in your lifetime, but unless you're from Colorado, you wouldn't know about how the state has a natural tendency for potato farming. That's why any kind of dish that was made out of them was widely popular there, but especially pancakes, because it restored some sense of normalcy in a time that was drastically changing day by day. Creamed brains on toast is the meal that makes squeamish eaters bolt from the table if there ever was one. During the Great Depression, resourcefulness was king, and nothing went to waste, not even a part of the animal. While many struggling families would eat brains, they were a delicacy. Don't be fooled by the word delicacy. This dish was born out of necessity, not gourmet aspirations. Making it was straightforward. Brains were boiled or sautéed with onions, milk, and a pinch of seasoning, cow or pig being the usual suspects. The mixture thickened to a creamy consistency and was ladled over toasted bread, often the stale kind, because, waste not, want not. It looked like a bizarre version of gravy toast, but it was Instagram-worthy, and it did fill bellies when there were few other options. Brains were rich and almost buttery, but convincing anyone to dig in was another matter entirely. Kids were probably bribed with the promise of dessert if they cleaned their plates even then. Creamed brains on toast is a long-gone American culinary staple today, existing only in the fringes of foodie culture, or as a trivia question about survival food. This dish is the love it or leave it symbol of grit and ingenuity. People used to really eat differently and buy their groceries differently too. In the Depression, there was a massive emphasis on buying foods that had a really long shelf life. Things like dried beans, rice, curated and salted meats, anything that could last a really long time, basically. You wouldn't know when you would need it. It was good to have around anyway because buying in bulk was something that let you have a neat little discount and you didn't need to do recurring grocery trips because something spoiled or wilted. That's why people always kept things with long shelf lives. Long before the days of refined sugar, people had to get creative when it came to sweetness. Enter maple sugar, a natural, flavorful treat made from the sap of maple trees. Native Americans were the first to perfect the art of maple syrup and sugar production. They would tap the trees in early spring, collecting sap, which was then boiled down until it turned into syrup. The real trick, however, was continuing to boil until the syrup crystallized into sugar. It wasn't a quick process, but the result was a potent sweetener that could be stored for months, long after the sap was gone. Maple sugar had the advantage of being locally available, unlike cane sugar, which had to be imported. Early settlers quickly adopted the method, and by the 18th century, it became a major industry in the northeastern US and Canada. It was a valuable resource, particularly in places where other sweeteners were hard to come by. The challenges of tapping trees and boiling the sap were labor-intensive, but the reward was worth it. Today, maple sugar might be a niche product, but for centuries, it was a sweet, vital part of life. Sometimes dinner was just onions, water, and a dream. Depression-era classic born of pure necessity, onion gravy on bread. Onions were the next best thing to flavor whatever scraps you had, or didn't have, when meat was scarce. The result? A simple, savory meal that was surprisingly satisfying, given its humble beginnings. Frying onions in a bit of lard or butter, if you were lucky, then simmering them in water and thickening the mixture with flour was the way the gravy was made. Voila! Pour this over a slice of bread, and dinner was served. Interestingly, onion gravy on bread became such a staple that it wasn't just limited to supper. It sometimes served as a breakfast or lunch, depending on what was available. The beauty of the dish was its ability to stretch the little food that people had into a comforting meal. And while the dish might not have earned high culinary acclaim back in the day, it was a true testament to the resourcefulness and resilience of families during the Great Depression. Even if the bread was stale, the gravy would soften it right up. It wasn't just about feeding an entire family, it was about stretching a single onion. Today, we may not think onion gravy on bread is much of a culinary wonder, but back then it was a lifeline. There's something charmingly rustic about the dish, believe it or not, and it's even made its way into the gourmet circles under fancier names like onion tartines. It wasn't a foodie trend for those who lived through the Great Depression. It was a tribute to creativity in the face of hardship. If these frugal tricks stirred up a memory, drop it in the comments, tap like, and subscribe for more stories cooked up from hard times.